You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi, everyone. Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest management. So, hey, glad to have you on board. Hope your week went well. I'm sure many of you are in the thick of things here in May, and when I'm recording this, of course. And so, hope you're making money and that you're keeping yourself safe out there. Hey, I'd like to thank you for taking me along with your ride today, or if you're watching from your desktop computer or phone, we're glad to have you, that you're like us enough to check us out. And so if you have questions, comments, thoughts, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Just opening up my website here and just wanted to spotlight my wildlife damage inspection handbook. If you're looking for some information to help bring up your game on inspection for wildlife damage, this is probably a manual you may want to check out. This is where it's different from wildlife books, because wildlife books typically talk about identification of animals in the wild, where this is about identifying animals and the damage that they cause in a human impacted environments like homes and lawns and gardens and that sort of thing, rather than being out in the middle of the woods somewhere. So check it out, and also some of the other resources that we have. Definitely have questions, comments, reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. All right, well, let's talk about what we're going to deal with this week, and we're going to deal with the brown recluse. Now, you may be thinking, Stephen, this is not a vertebrate. I thought this was the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast that deals with all things technical related to vertebrate pests, and you are correct. However, we do talk on insects. In this case, I know it's not an insect, everybody. I know it doesn't have 3 parts. It's an arachnid. It has, a cephalothorax. I get that, but just bear with me. We're dealing with these types of organisms when they have an impact on people doing wildlife control. That's where they're dealing with vertebrates. Why? Because you may be crawling around an attic or a crawl space and encounter one of these. And so what is the risk for you as a professional? What is the risk for your clients, right? Just like we talked about ticks last week, we're going to be talking about the brown recluse this week, because it's got a little bit of a reputation, to be sure. Well, how much danger is there for those of you who are professionals, because you're crawling in places that the average individual is not doing? So theoretically, you're at a higher risk of a potential encounter with one of these animals, right? So the brown recluse, and certainly their bites are serious. And how do we know this? Well, because we have evidence here from the CDC. These are asserted to be brown recluse bites, and you can see this is where we get what's called necrosis, and that's where there's cellular death that occurs in the skin, and that is certainly a potential threat. And it can take a while for these to heal, and they can get infected, and things can go bad, maybe even septic, right? So septic is where the infection begins to hit the bloodstream and then does some nasty things to your body. Nevertheless, even if it doesn't go that far, it's not something that's pleasant to have. And so it's something to take seriously. And there have been people who have suffered from these brown recluse bites. But how big of a threat is it, right? So anyways, there's been some recent research, and by recent, I mean this. I encountered this particular article in April of 2026, so that tells you how recent this actually is. So let me highlight the authors and the title of the article itself, and this is Louis A. Coticchio, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Debbie L. Casil, Recluse Spiders, Araneae, Sicariidae, Contesting Myths on Distribution, Bite Behavior, and Medical Risk in Florida. And this was published in the Journal of Medical Entomology, 2026, volume 63. And of course, they're using basically a sort of a DOI now, and the tag number is TJAG004. So it's published this year, and like I said, I just saw this last month. I think it's when it came out, and it is Louis A. Coticchio, that's Coticchio, and Debbie L. Cassill, that's Cassill, and they are, I'm assuming, faculty members, one in the University of Florida, another one in the University of South Florida, and title of their article is Recluse Spiders, Araneae, Sicariidae, Contesting Myths on Distribution, Bite Behavior, and Medical Risk in Florida. Journal of Medical Entomology, so you know this is a serious journal, right? It's published by the Entomological Society of America, so this is where you want to get your information on insects, to be sure. And it's 2026, that's this year it was published, and the volume 63, tagline TJAG004. That's volume 63, TJAG004. All right, well, I hope that came through. So the information I'm going to be summarizing here is drawn from this particular journal article, and they basically talk about 4 misconceptions that people have about the brown recluse spider. And the first one is that it occurs in more areas than it actually does, right? So that people think its range is larger than it actually is. The second misconception is that the fiddle is definitive for identification, and they raise some questions about that. Third, that the bites of this spider always causes cellular death. And then fourthly, that they are aggressive biters, and they claim that that is certainly not the case, as you can imagine. So here we deal with the first mythology, or the first misconception. Maybe myth is a little bit too strong of a term. And you can see the smudge map here in light green shows you the spider's traditional range within the United States. And you notice the arrows are pointing to places where it appears to be expanding its range. But nevertheless, what the authors were saying is that yes, the spider can be found elsewhere in the country, but it tends not to do all that well there. And that, there's certainly climate issues or habitat issues that allow the spider to be elsewhere. But if it goes into other places, it's typically because someone moved it there. This is not a spider that's really out trying to expand its range, right, and sort of cruising along. So it tends to hitchhike along people moving. People move from the south to the north, and it appears that when people encounter it outside of this particular region, it's often there accidentally or because someone has transported it, right? And that's certainly a problem with our interconnected world and the amount of importing and exporting that's done, that things hitch rides, right? And so this spider certainly can do that. You can see some arrows there. It shows you places where the spider seems to be found more frequently. But when you think about it, Florida has undergone some unbelievable population explosion because a lot of people are moving down there, especially after COVID. People are going to places in different states. Some states are losing population. Some states are gaining population. And of course, the spider is going to hitch a ride in those situations. All right. Well, the second misconception that the authors were speaking about is misidentification. Now, it certainly makes a lot of sense to me that the wolf spider and the grass spider could be misidentified as a brown recluse, but how did the cellar spider get misidentified? Probably, those spindly legs, or because certainly the brown recluse can look like it has some legs, that are certainly larger than its body, as these other spiders are. But, it's hard to imagine. But I just wanted to sort of remind you out there that stress and people who have fears about animals, especially like arachnophobia, people who have a fear of spiders, stress can cause us to misidentify. And just knowing people misidentifying animals in the vertebrate world, it certainly can happen in the arachnid world, the insect world, right? So keep that in mind. And so it can be very hard. And, don't argue with your client over the identification. Just you have to be careful that not everyone who's claiming they've seen something actually saw it, and that it could be something completely different. Those of you that are familiar with how many people think they've seen bobcats out of the woods, when in fact, when You compare the morphology of the animal. It's not a bobcat, it's someone's house cat. It's a big joke within the wildlife field. Nevertheless, people do misidentify, and even you, so keep that in mind that sometimes people think they have these brown recluses around and they don't. The third misconception is that all the bites cause necrosis. That's cellular death in the tissues. And the fact of the matter is less than 10% of all brown recluse bites lead to necrosis. Now, that's good news, right? So what accounts for all of these reports of where there is necrotization, and what the authors were suggesting is that some of these injuries are actually caused by other things, caused like tick-borne infections, bacteria, fungal infections, allergic reactions, and also, kind of scarily, although tick-borne infections are certainly nothing to sneeze at, to be sure, carcinoma, and that's, of course, a skin cancer. And so keep in mind that just because someone has a bad mark on their skin and they claim they were bitten by a spider doesn't necessarily mean that actually what happened. And sometimes people are misidentifying what's caused the skin problem. Now, I've heard elsewhere that it's just virtually or practically impossible to identify the cause of an injury to skin and to claim that it's, from a bite and that it occurred to a specific animal or insect. It's just very, very difficult to do that. So keep that in the back of your mind. Again, don't argue with your clients over this, but just understand that there's a lot of people who are claiming bites, and even when claiming that they were it was identified as by a doctor that it was a bite from a brown recluse, when in fact it actually wasn't. It was other things that occurred with that particular infection or skin damage. So unless you have the spider with you, and that the spider can be conclusively identified as the cause of the injury, and then the spider being accurately identified, you're really going up a creek, right? And so that's not something you want to be getting involved in. So there's a lot of misdiagnosis out there, to be sure. Now let's talk a little bit about the bite of the spider itself. And so 4 months after having, I guess that's this injury here in the photo, 4 months after having been bitten by a brown recluse spider, localized tissue necrosis in the medial right calf. And you can see that there in the photo, that big round mark in the middle. That's 4 months after having been bitten. So it's serious, right? So when people are actually bitten by a brown recluse and it goes necrotic, it's nothing to sneeze at, right? So we're not saying it's impossible for this to happen. What we're saying, what the research is, not me, I'm not saying, and I'm just simply repeating what the researchers are saying, is that it's not happening as anywhere near as often as people tend to think. But when it does, it's nothing to sneeze at. So when someone gets bitten by a brown recluse, what happens? Well, believe it or not, most of the time, or frequently, the bite doesn't even get noticed, right? And if it is noticed, the person may just feel it as a pinprick. And now think about it. You're crawling around an attic and you feel a little pinch and you're like, well, maybe I just got a sliver. Maybe I just hit a nail. Maybe a nail was just jutting out of a board a little bit too far and it penetrated your glove or something. And you might just feel it as a skin prick. You might not feel anything. Of course, how often have we gone through an attic and then we don't realize injuries to our body that occurred, several hours later because we're taking off our equipment, and then we realize, oh, we got cuts, we got scratches, and didn't even realize it, right? Well, that's kind of what can happen with a brown recluse bite. So that's the other challenge in terms of identifying it as a brown recluse bite. However, for people who have been bitten by this animal, usually 2 to 8 hours after the encounter, they may experience severe pain, some swelling, and localized tissue death. And that's due to the spider's venom, which contains proteolytic enzymes. And so what this means is that when the spider is biting something, let's say you're an insect and he bites the insect, he injects these enzymes inside of the insect and it actually pre-digests that insect so that the spider can then suck out those particular juices and eat it. That's kind of what happens to us if we get bitten by a brown recluse spider, right? And so that's what causes that cellular death. But again, less than 10% of all brown recluse bites actually go through this necrotization process. Okay, so that's good news. Now, the fourth and final misconception that people have about the brown recluse spider is that it is an aggressive biter. And so what the researchers did was that they took two different species of recluse spiders. One was the Mediterranean recluse spider, and the other one was native to the United States. And then they also studied three different species of wolf spiders that occur in Florida. And they tried to put them in different types of situations to see if they could get the spider to bite. Now, technically speaking, these spiders are actually biting under pressure, right? So that's not really something that would be considered an aggressive bite. It's more of a defensive bite, but they had to somehow stimulate them to try to get them to bite, right? So just to give you an idea of what aggressive biting is versus defensive biting, typically an aggressive biting is, let's say we'll use a dog, for example. A dog is in a yard, you're walking on the street, you're not even looking at the dog, you're not engaging with the dog runs off the property and bites you. That's an aggressive bite. As opposed to you see a dog, you approach the dog, you threaten the dog, and then the dog bites you. That would be considered a defensive bite, right? Now, they couldn't mimic this completely with spiders, right? Because so they had to try to stimulate the spiders to get them to bite. Now, so technically that would be considered a defensive bite. But nevertheless, it should give you at least a little bit of an indices as to how quickly the spiders bite. So what they did is they developed these gel spoons and pressers to sort of mimic the feel of the consistency of human skin. And then they would press the spider in different ways to try to get it to react and to bite these particular objects. And they did it in 5 different ways. They would press against the jaws of the spider. They would pinch its foreleg or hind leg. They would squeeze the cephalothorax, or they would do dorsal compression, or they do ventral compression. Remember, dorsal is the back, ventral is the bottom, to see if they could stimulate the spider to bite. And they would do these. They had 8 of the, if memory serves, they had 8 of the recluse spiders, and then they also had a variety of the wolf spiders. And they would do this 20 times. What they found is that the brown recluse spiders, their median bite activity was 0%. That is, as a general rule, they were not reacting to these provocations. Now, when they did bite, they typically occurred in a situation where the spider would have been pressed between an arm and the clothing. Like it's being compressed underneath. If I'm squeezing my arm down here, that's what would make the spider bite. So that compression force would cause the spider to bite. And even then, it didn't even do it half the time. It did it less than half the time among the spiders that they had. Now, in contrast, the wolf spiders, remember, they tested 2 of the recluse spider species and they tested 3 of the wolf spider species. The wolf spiders bit 80% of the time at the median level. Remember, median means half the indications are above that, half the indications are below that. 80% of the time they were biting, which is amazing, right? So if you really want to get bit by something, fuss with a wolf spider because they're much more likely to bite as opposed to the brown recluse, which is an amazing fact, right? So they wanted to just really emphasize this particular point. The brown recluse spider is not hunting you down trying to bite you, right? If it bites you, it had to be really provoked to doing it, okay? So that's good news for us. They also did a survey of locations in Florida. Over 5 years, reports where people claim to have had spiders, and then they went out to those properties. They identified 220 of them, and then they went out to those properties and found those spiders. And what they found was only 8.6% of the properties that thought they had brown recluse spiders actually had brown recluse spiders. Because this particular species, when the young are born, they tend to hang around and cluster. That's why it sometimes can be difficult to get rid of an infestation, because they're not really wanting to leave a location. They kind of hang out, right? They're not like other animals that tend to disperse. These kind of hang out in an area where they're born. And they also noted that people have been living with brown recluse spiders for years without being bitten, because the spider is really an ambush predator. It likes to hang out in its nesting area, which has a web, and then when a prey comes by, they will then attack it. So I think they said only 8% of the spider's time is spent actively hunting and in interacting with prey. Most of the time, it's just hanging out in its web, in its nesting area, and it's not really doing much of anything. So again, it's not an animal that's going to be hunting you down, trying to bite you. So what are the concluding thoughts here? Number one, don't diagnose your bites. Very difficult to do it right, and even professionals who have lots of experience, not probably going to get it right very often. Get confirmation of the spider to confirm that it's actually a brown recluse, right? So if you can capture the spider and have it accurately identified by an entomologist, that gives you much more confidence that you have at least the correct diagnosis of the spider itself. Third, don't fear the spider. They're not out there looking for you. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have any concern. What it means, if you're going into attics, you're going into crawl spaces, make sure you're wearing proper PPE. Think about what you're moving around, where you're putting your body parts. But don't think that the animal is trying to bite you, right? They're biting when they're under some sort of provocation. That's typically like when they're being squeezed. So be careful where you're putting hands, feet, knees, when you're trying to move boxes around and you're going into things and doing your inspection. Consider making sure you're wearing proper PPE. I think if you're going into crawl spaces, it's probably a good idea to put on a Tyvek suit. I know it makes things hotter. I know it can be difficult, but nevertheless, make sure you're wearing proper PPE, particularly for those of you who are in a brown recluse country. But also think about the habitat, right? Spiders need prey. If there's not prey inside that attic, or if the conditions aren't right, chances are it's not going to have the spiders. So those of you that are entomologists that do a lot more work with insects, think about when you do get an area where you find a spider, think about what are the conditions that allow this spider to stay here. Right now in the South, maybe that's everywhere because it's really humid and very moist in parts of the South. But when I was up in Nebraska, and there was a school that had an infestation of brown recluse spiders. The school had a moisture problem, had a humidity problem, and that's what allowed those spiders to stay there. And of course, insects need humidity, so the spiders could live there and their prey could live there, right? And so it was a very difficult situation to try to control because it was in a sort of a trough, and I guess so when it rained, water would collect and there was a lot of moisture there. So, but nevertheless, don't fear it, be cognizant of it, and that kind of hopefully gives you a little bit more a relief, I hope, in terms of understanding that the risk to us is low. It's not zero, but it's low, and that there are going to be other threats out there. And so I hope you found that research. I'm certainly fascinated by it, and I hope you were too. Well, I'm Stephen Van Tassel. You've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we've been discussing brown recluse spiders and what the threat is. There is a threat there, but it's probably not the same level of threat as other things you may encounter in crawl spaces and attics and that sort of thing. So in terms of relative risk, be careful, be cognizant, don't be paranoid, protect yourself, and be well out there, everyone. Until next time, Take care, everybody.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Van Tassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.